And yet, there's a whole bunch of people right now who are actively defending the police for arresting this guy, and some of them have gone so far as to praise the police for their ability to withhold fire and take him alive. What? I got questions. I got real questions. When Dylan Roof went into an African-American church and shot 9 people, they took him to Burger King on the way to jail. I don't know if you know that or not. What? They arrested him and he said he was hungry, so they went through the drive-thru at Burger King and got him a burger because he was hungry, right? If Dylan Roof were a black youth in this country, he wouldn't have got a burger, he'd have gotten a beating, and you know it. And that's the problem with the way we create these narratives of covert racism. They allow that type of thing to happen, and we have a hard time dealing with it because we have dissonance at the level of our cultural discourse. Yeah? All right, I'll just assume that you're with me on this. All right, so this is what white supremacy looks like. This type of white supremacy manifests as a racialized consciousness. That is a consciousness that seeks out examples of racism we don't participate in to get us off the hook for the racism we do participate in. The best example of this, probably, is the Black Lives Matter movement constantly being criticized by the counterclaim that all lives matter. Yes, all lives matter. But the position denies the long history of domination and oppression at work in minority communities, which is to say, even if all lives matter, if we accept that as true, we don't actually live that way, right? You can't say all lives matter and continue to participate in indirect and direct forms of oppression and domination. You don't really mean it when you say it, and if you don't mean it when you say it, it must not be true, right? But black lives have to matter if we're going to talk about police brutality. If we're going to talk about over-policing, if we're going to talk about white police officers in African-American communities they don't actually live in, right? There's real problems here that we could address and talk about. Okay? So this is how you should be thinking of race. So how does this fit with environmental activism? It's the need not merely to recognize that environmental harms are disproportionately placed upon minority communities, but that we often allow this because of the scientific and capitalist narratives that dominate the way we think about the world as resources. When we allow science and technology to tell us what is valuable, right, what we need, where it should come from, how we should get it, when that's the narrative, and it disproportionately places minorities under the burden of either harboring the hazards of our capitalist society, which we'll talk about in a minute, or providing those resources to their own detriment, which we'll talk about in a minute. You have a problem where science and technology are nothing more than the master's new whip. This is a problem when we're trying to think about how best to address environmental problems. Okay? Treating the environment merely as resources allows us to devalue certain places, certain things, and by extension, certain people. The best and most recent example of this is the Keystone XL pipeline. Originally planned to pass near a predominantly white neighborhood, the pipeline route was changed after the white community protested. Obviously, because the pipeline sucks and nobody wants it in their backyard. The result is that the pipeline was rerouted through Cannonball, North Dakota, imperiling the lives of the native peoples there. And if you ever watched the news, you saw that there were water guns, police dogs, like tear gas, rubber bullets. People were getting killed and shot and harmed because we're going to put a pipeline there. Because native communities don't have the social capital for their protests to have the same sort of effect. Because politicians don't expect native people's vote to change the outcome of an election. So you can steamroll that neighborhood, but you can't make the whites angry because they actually give money to campaigns and vote. And because they have that sort of social capital, you want to keep them happy. It's a covert racism embedded in an environmental problem. The problem is the pipeline shouldn't have been built. That's environmental justice. And that's what almost everybody associated with environmental justice thinks, right? The pipeline is bad. Let's get rid of the pipeline, right? But the point at which it was being built, where it was being built, is racism. Right? It's a form of racism. Okay. There's another example then that we might use to draw our attention to this issue, which is Flint, Michigan. Right? And we can use Flint to extrapolate the same sort of dizzying lack of empathy for Flint's residents that was shown in the Keystone situation. It's not that Flint has undrinkable poisonous water. That's not even the issue. We could easily explain that away as poor governance with respect to infrastructure. We could talk about industry abuses that made the situation in Flint possible. But at some point, we're going to have to talk about the lack of a response to the situation 5 years later when the problem has been declared resolved, but the residents still can't safely drink the water, right? To say nothing of the fact that the neighborhood is predominantly African American, but if you go just a little ways south into Bloomington Hills and some of those areas around North Detroit that are wealthy white communities, they have no fear of the same thing happening to them, right? They're on record as saying, well, that wouldn't happen here, right? But it happened just north of there, right? And then even if you wanted to explain away when it really happened, like when it happened in the moment, right? 5 years later, these people still can't use their water, right? And now it's been resolved. I'm struggling to find a resolution, but you know, what do I know, right? I don't live in Michigan. I live in Wisconsin, right? At some point, so examples like this abound and are not hard to find. The difficulty in dealing with this is that many people focus on sustainability or baby seals or air pollution and then ignore more direct concerns affecting the lives of people that are living in their communities, either saddled with the burden of housing environmental hazards or that have been displaced by them or for the industries that create them, right? And displacement is also a form of racism, right? Rarely do you see in history where a white community was uprooted and sent on a trail of tears, right? That kind of narrative doesn't exist because we don't do that to white communities, right? We buy white communities out. We just uproot minority communities and send them down the road, right? And this is what's happening with industry today when companies want to come in and build a factory or use the resources. They usually do it where they know there's not going to be successful resistance, right? This is a really good example of this, which isn't in this country, but probably is somewhere. Pepsi wanted to build a bottling facility in India because they were going to get cheap labor. And they told the Indian government, here's what we'll do. We'll build this giant facility, we'll pay an above average wage, we'll employ hundreds of people, and it'll be great. All you got to do is give us access to your groundwater. And the Indian government said, well, that area needs jobs and they need money, let's do it. Pepsi went in, tapped the groundwater, siphoned so much of it off, they dried up all the rice paddies. And all these farmers that lived in the area for about 100 miles couldn't grow rice. They were all forced to work for Pepsi. But then Pepsi went, we don't need this many workers. So they sent them down the line to become poor on the streets in cities south of where they built the plant. And now there's a food desert because there's not enough water. And Pepsi's making a killing, right? That's a problem because Pepsi couldn't do that in a wealthy neighborhood, and they couldn't do it in a white neighborhood, at least not a white neighborhood that had any sort of social capital, okay? So this is sort of also a problem, okay? Before we consider any more examples, let's define environmental racism. You'll notice that it has the same tone and focus as covert racism, and that is because environmental racism is a form of and a facet of covert institutional systemic racism. Environmental racism is a policy or practice that differentially affects or disadvantages, either intentionally or unintentionally, individuals, groups, or communities because of their race and or class. And that last little bit is going to be important for talking about our racialized consciousness here in a minute. Right? It has been well documented around the world that environmental hazards often impact poor communities and communities of color disproportionately. 3 out of every 5 African Americans living below the poverty line are also living in areas situated close to toxic waste sites, according to the government's GAO. Right? Waste disposal facilities are more likely to be located in poor minority neighborhoods, as are dirty industries, toxic waste, and these communities are more likely to be located near resource extraction sites as well. Let's consider just a few examples, right? I'll do this kind of briefly. Pig farms in North Carolina. You probably don't know much about pig farms in North Carolina, but they are disproportionately located near black communities, and many of them have been relocated away from white communities, and I'll tell you why. I'm sure you're familiar with pigs, right? Pigs are really smart. They're also really dirty, right? And they produce a lot of waste. And one of the things that pigs produce a lot of is urine. And what these pig farms do is they collect the urine in big giant lagoons, right? Big clay-lined ditches, big holes, right? And it just fills up with urine. And then when it gets hot, it's North Carolina, it's hot down there. When it gets hot, the urine evaporates, just like water. And then when it rains urine, uric acid. And these people can't go outside in the rain because it rains pee on them, right? And so when you think, and this is just one of the hazards, right? This is just one of the hazards. Research has shown that these pig farms are responsible for both air and water pollution, mostly due to the vast manure lagoons that are created to hold the pigs' waste. In North Carolina, it's been said that the number of pigs on factory farms exceeds the total population in the state. The contamination from North Carolina pig farms has yielded dangerous concentrations of groundwater nitrates, a leading cause of blue baby syndrome, which is when a baby has a defective heart when it's born. Hydrogen sulfide has also caused noticeable increases in respiratory ailments near these sites. During the summer of 1995, there were 7 major spills from waste lagoons in North Carolina, 6 of which were hog-related. Right? That's the pigs caused the spill, right? They broke the lagoons because pigs like to root around. They like playing in mud, right? So what do you expect them to do? Right? As a result of these spills, more than 30 million gallons of hog waste poured into the waterways in North Carolina, resulting in over 15 million fish killed in the state's river systems in 1 year. Right? Now what usually happens in this situation is everybody goes, oh my God, the fish are dying, we got to clean the rivers. And nobody goes, we got to get rid of pig farms in poor communities. Right? We all stop short because we're focused on the environmental issue and not environmental justice. That's racism. Yeah? In Louisiana, in a stretch of land between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, a predominantly African American area, there are more than 150 petrochemical companies and 17 refineries that release dangerous levels of toxic chemicals into the air and water. In the predominantly black community of Mossville, 91% of residents said they are experiencing health complications attributable to the 14 facilities that manufacture, process, store, or discharge toxic or hazardous substances in their community. 14 in one community, right? That's not an accident. They're not really good at like toxic waste facility management. That's not why they're all there, right? There's a different reason, right? This slice of America and Louisiana represents what has come to be known as Cancer Alley, right? Living there is a death sentence. And if you're poor and you can't pick up and move somewhere, you're stuck there. And if you're stuck there, it's a death sentence, right? This is environmental racism. In a Texas town, Sunnyside, in the late 1960s, a landfill and incinerator were proposed on a large tract of land suitable for the purpose. However, the land was also close to a white community which opposed the construction of the landfill. The city of Houston relented and the landfill site was moved. It was relocated near a majority African American population, and despite opposition from the Sunnyside community, the landfill was put in place. Now I'll point out this was in the 60s, right? So you're in the midst of a civil rights movement. The white community says don't do it. The African American community used the exact same language and said don't do it, and Houston said get over it, we need a place to put our trash, right? You'll notice that's exactly what happened in the Keystone XL pipeline situation, right? This is not an isolated incident, right? It's not that it happens in Texas and North Dakota. It happens everywhere. It's pattern behavior. That's racism, right? The Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, which monitors all decommissioned landfills, right? This landfill was closed in 1974. The Texas Commission on Environmental Quality says that the land is still contaminated with high levels of metals, pesticides, solvents, and potentially toxic volatile organic compounds. Because of its toxicity, the community cannot use that land to build a community center they've been saving money for over a decade because the land's too toxic for people to use, right? Even though it's been sitting fallow for a generation and a half, right? Not all racism is local, however, and the United States, as well as several of its allies, ship their waste to less developed countries. I don't know if you know this or not, but we sell our garbage. We don't just throw it away, and we don't give it away, we sell it. So we put it on barges, like you put it on your curb, it goes into a truck. The truck takes it to a centralized point. They put it on bigger trucks. They take it to the coast. They put it on barges. The barges take it to places like India or less developed countries in Africa, and we sell it to them for like 20 cents a ton, right? And they buy all of our garbage. And then they open the bags, they dump it out, and they separate it into compostable material, recyclable material, and trash, right? We buy the compost back once it composts, and we buy the recyclables back, but we buy them back at a penny a ton. And they have to separate it into aluminum, tin, copper, glass, plastic, or whatever. Then we buy it back at a penny per ton. We ship it back over here and put it into our recycling plants and go, hey, look, we made jobs for Americans. Right? But we got rid of all the trash in the interim. And all of the trash that doesn't get recycled stays in the country that bought it. There's a city in India that used to buy garbage like this as a way to create jobs for their poor people. They ended up getting a lot of our e-waste, like old computers and televisions as we upgraded to flat screens and stuff, and they would pull all the recyclable stuff out, the glass screen, the plastic boxes and stuff, but the interior they just kept. And these started to pile up so much that the mercury leaked into the soil, and the entire city had to be fenced off, quarantined, and everybody had to be moved because it's so toxic you can't go there now because it's mercury saturated, right? All those people were displaced. It's also created a fourth class of people in the developing world, known as waste pickers. If you've ever seen Slumdog Millionaire, at the very beginning, spoiler alert, at the very beginning of the movie, right, there's like all these mountains of trash, and these people kind of live there. They're waste pickers. And they are people who live in the trash and go through it and sell it to the person who owns the trash dump. And the person who owns the trash dump sells it back to the United States, right? And he pays a pittance because he's only going to make a pittance. And so it creates a fourth class of poverty known as waste picking. Okay? So this is something that the United States does elsewhere. There are plenty of examples that could be used, but it's important to focus on the problem, which is best expressed in broad strokes. When you look at the neighborhoods that are where you have a lot of different waste facilities, the people who live closest are oftentimes the most vulnerable people who have the fewest resources to escape neighborhoods because of residential segregation, housing discrimination, and limited incomes. Just because you're poor, just because you live physically on the wrong side of the tracks doesn't mean that you should be dumped on. Those people are predominantly minorities. In fact, more than half of the 9 million people living within 2 miles of the nation's hazardous waste facilities are minorities. And more than 70% of those living in fence line areas are minorities. Fence line areas are those areas around a hazardous site that are considered like danger zones. They're not directly hazardous, but it's like this facility is going to pollute 50 miles. The fence line would be the 20-mile radius around that 50 miles. So when you look at the fence line areas, almost a full 3/4 of the population are minorities, right? That should strike you as a problem, right? It's not an accident that these facilities, hazards and toxic waste are located where they are. But consider just one more example. In 1969, Union Carbide had a leak at a pesticide production facility in Bhopal, India, releasing toxic methyl isocyanate into the environment. Like, that just sounds dangerous, right? It's got cyanide in it. Did you catch that? Right? Methyl isocyanate. In the aftermath of the leak, 2,500 people were dead. 400,000 had serious injuries or illnesses caused by the leak. The Indian government further victimized these people by settling out of court with Union Carbide for $470 million. That amount, distributed over nearly 550,000 claimants in the suit, wasn't even able to cover the majority of their medical expenses, not to mention their suffering, to say nothing of their legal fees. Right? And so this is how this is covert racism. This is how it works, right? This is just a really obvious example of it. The people were left to cover the balance. Settling out of court also ruined any future hopes for India and the people of Bhopal to press the issue, because the issue's been settled. Now, I tell you that so I can tell you this. There's only one place in America that we allow Union Carbide to manufacture methyl isocyanate. One place in the whole country. It's a little town called Institute in West Virginia. It's almost 90% African American. It's located 10 miles north of Charleston. And a few years ago, they had a leak of methyl isocyanate that sent 135 people to the hospital before they could stop it. And nothing has happened to Union Carbide as punishment. Right? So they killed 2,500 people in India and injured almost 500,000. Then they came here and built a plant, put it in an African American community that couldn't resist, and now they're having leaks and problems in their facility here, and they're starting to kill those residents, and we're responding with no real sort of pushback. Now, what most people are thinking is that this only proves primarily that poor people are at risk, that it does not necessarily prove racism is taking place. But this fails on two counts. One, and the simplest to identify, is the lack of understanding at the level of intersectionality. Just because poor whites suffer disproportionately compared to other whites or other poor people, and some of them do, as in Appalachia, but by identifying poverty as the marker of importance, the second failing actually stands out more starkly, which is racialized consciousness. A recent study done in 2015 determined that in 46 out of 50 states, minorities lived in areas with higher rates of air pollution than their white counterparts, regardless of income. Okay? Speaking directly to this issue, Robert Boulard, who is the individual who pioneered environmental racism and environmental justice, has this to say. America is segregated and so is pollution. When you try to unpack it, when people suggest pollution is following poverty and not racism, it's wrong. People get dumped on because of the color of their skin, and that is racism. It's hard to see the nuance, and it's easy to dismiss race and inequality when talking about the environment. Racism is such an overarching aspect in the United States that when you talk about it and point it out, the knee-jerk reaction is often to reference Black Lives Matter and say, hey, we all matter. But it's not that no one else matters, it's that black lives are the ones to deal with the police brutality, the criminal justice system, and the disproportionate dumping of hazardous waste. We must do better if we intend to go forward. Thank you. There you go.